Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. Grief is a country with no map. It is a vast, silent, and deeply personal landscape, and once you are in it, you are a citizen for life. My citizenship began on a Tuesday in October. The official cause of death, according to the coroner's report, was blunt force trauma and structural collapse. A clinical, sterile, and utterly inadequate collection of words to describe the violent, final silence that had taken my wife, Cora. My name is Jasper, and for the past year I have been the sole, lonely inhabitant of the country of her absence. We had a strange and beautiful passion, Cora and I. We were urban explorers. We were photographers of decay, archivists of the forgotten. We saw a profound, haunting beauty in the places the world had abandoned. The silent, dust-choked wards of a derelict asylum. The rusting, skeletal remains of a once great factory. The grand, peeling ballrooms of a forgotten hotel. We were not daredevils. We were historians of a sort, documenting the slow, inevitable entropy of all human endeavor. Our love story was written in the language of peeling paint, of shattered glass, of the lonely, single ray of sunlight piercing the gloom of a collapsed roof. The old abandoned Mercy General Hospital was supposed to be our masterpiece. It was a local legend, a massive Gothic structure that had been empty for 50 years, a place of ghost stories and whispered rumors. We had planned the expedition for months, studying the old blueprints, plotting our entry, our route through its decaying circulatory system. The accident was a freak occurrence, a moment of pure, unpredictable physics. A section of the ceiling in the old surgical wing, its integrity compromised by years of water damage, had given way. I had been a few feet ahead of her, photographing a beautiful, archaic operating theater light. I heard the groan of stressed plaster, a sound like a dying breath. I heard her cry out my name. And then the roar, a cloud of dust and the terrible, final sound of a life ending. I was the one who found her. I was the one who held her hand, her warm, vibrant artist's hand as it grew cold in the sudden, terrible silence. I have no memory of the hours that followed. The call to 911, the arrival of the fire crews, the questions from the police. It is all a blur, a traumatic ellipsis in the narrative of my life. My first coherent memory is of him, our best friend, Liam. He was at the hospital, his face a shattered mask of grief and disbelief. He had been the third member of our strange little tribe. He wasn't an explorer himself. He claimed to be too clumsy and too scared of tetanus, but he was our biggest supporter, our anchor in the real world. He loved our stories. He admired our photographs. He was the brother I never had, the one person in the world who understood the strange, beautiful language that Cora and I had shared. In the days and weeks that followed, Liam was my shadow, my keeper. He handled the logistics of the funeral, a task my own grief-paralyzed mind was incapable of. He fielded the calls from concerned relatives. He sat with me for long, silent hours in my house, a house that had become a museum of Cora's absence. Its silence a constant, screaming testament to the noise that was missing. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me it would be okay. He just sat with me in the wreckage, a fellow survivor, and his silent, steady presence was the only thing that kept me from completely dissolving into the country of my own sorrow. He had a perfect, unshakable alibi for the day of the accident. It was his sister's wedding, in another state, 300 miles away. He had been the man of honor. I remembered the planning, the stress, the endless discussions about his speech. He had been devastated that he couldn't be there to wish us luck on our big exploration of Mercy General. I had the text message he had sent me that morning, a picture of him in his tuxedo, looking awkward and handsome. "Break a leg," he had written, a piece of dark, unintentional irony that now felt like a curse. "Wish I was with you guys. Be safe." Be safe. The words were a bitter, cruel joke. For a year, I drifted. My life was a series of empty rooms and long, sleepless nights. The world had lost its color, its texture. Liam was my only connection to the life I had before. We would meet for dinner once a week, a sad, quiet ritual. We would talk about her. We would tell the old stories. We were two old soldiers reminiscing about a war that only we had fought in, a country that only we had known. Her photography equipment, her cameras, her lenses, her boxes of undeveloped film and uncatalogued memory cards, they all sat in her small home studio, untouched. The room was a shrine, and I was its terrified, unwilling priest. I could not bring myself to enter it. To touch her things would be to admit that she was not just coming back from a long trip. It would be to accept the finality of her silence. It was Liam in his gentle, patient way who finally convinced me. "You have to do it, Jas," he said one evening, his voice soft. "It's her legacy. All those beautiful images she captured. They shouldn't be left to die in a box. It's the last, best part of her. You need to preserve it, for her and for you." He was right. It was a task I had been avoiding, a final, terrible act of mourning. But it was also, I knew, a necessary one. I had to walk back into the country of our shared past one last time in order to have any hope of finding a future. The project began on a rainy Saturday, the one-year anniversary of her death. I opened the door to her studio. The air was still and thick with the faint chemical scent of darkroom fluids and her perfume, a ghostly combination that almost brought me to my knees. Her cameras were on the shelf, silent and beautiful. Her notebooks were on the desk, filled with her elegant looping script, her notes on light and composition. I started with the old stuff, the boxes of negatives from our early years. I bought a high-end film scanner, a machine that felt like a piece of scientific equipment, a time machine. The process was slow, meticulous, and deeply, profoundly painful. Each image that bloomed on my computer screen was a ghost, a memory of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. There she was, laughing on a beach, her hair a wild halo in the sun. There we were, two young, hopeful people, standing in front of the first abandoned house we had ever explored together. I was not just digitizing photographs, I was conducting a digital seance, resurrecting the ghosts of our love, one by one. I worked my way through the years. The boxes of film gave way to the hard drives of her digital era. I navigated the familiar, ordered architecture of her files, a system I knew as well as my own. Her mind was as organized and as beautiful as her compositions. Each trip, each exploration had its own folder, meticulously labeled and dated. I was an archaeologist, carefully brushing the dust away from the artifacts of our life. The final hard drive was the one from her last camera, the one they had recovered from the wreckage at Mercy General. The camera itself had been crushed, but the memory card, miraculously, was intact. I hesitated for a long time, my hand hovering over the card reader. This was the final roll, the last images she had ever seen, the last moments of her life, recorded and preserved in a small, black rectangle of plastic and silicone. This was the heart of the tomb. I took a deep breath and I inserted the card. The files appeared on the screen, a series of thumbnails. My heart was a slow, heavy drum. I clicked on the first image. It was a beautiful, haunting shot of the empty hospital lobby, the light from a high, arched window creating a perfect, ethereal beam in the dust-filled air. It was a classic Cora shot, finding the sacred in the profane. I moved through the images, one by one. A close-up of a peeling sign that read maternity. A long shot of an empty, echoing hallway. Her eye, her unique, compassionate vision was as sharp and as clear as ever. She had been on top of her game that day. And then I came to the last 3 photographs on the card. They were taken in the surgical wing, just minutes before the collapse. The first shot was of the archaic operating light I had been photographing, its multiple glass eyes like some strange robotic insect. The second was a wider shot of the same room, showing the beautiful tiled walls and the decay that was creeping in at the edges. The third shot? The third shot was the one that stopped my heart. It was a self-portrait. She would sometimes do this, set the camera on a timer, and take a picture of herself in the spaces we explored. It was her way of signing her work.
In this one, she was standing in the middle of the operating theater. She was not smiling. She had a strange, thoughtful, almost sad expression on her face. It was a beautiful, haunting, and deeply prophetic image. A portrait of a woman in her final moments. I stared at the image for a long time, my vision blurring with tears. And then, the professional photographer in me, the part that was still on some vestigial level functioning, noticed a technical flaw. There was a strange, distorted reflection in the curved, polished chrome of the operating light, just above her head. It was a common problem in reflective environments. I zoomed in, my intention to see if I could Photoshop the distracting element out to make her final portrait perfect. The reflection was a warped, funhouse mirror image of the room behind her. But it was not empty. There was a figure there, a tall, distorted shape, standing in the shadows of the doorway, just a few feet behind where she was standing. My first thought was that it was me, but I had been in a different part of the room, to her left. This figure was directly behind her. My blood ran cold. I zoomed in further, the pixels of the image dissolving into a meaningless digital soup. But the shape was still there, a human shape. I frantically opened the second-to-last photograph, the wider shot of the room. I scanned it, my eyes darting back and forth like a madman. And I found it. In the corner of the frame, there was a small, cracked piece of a mirror still hanging on the wall. And in its reflection, for a fraction of a second, caught in the ambient light, was a face. A face that was not mine. A face that was not a stranger's. It was the face of Liam, my best friend. The man who was supposed to be 300 miles away at his sister's wedding. A man with a perfect, unshakable alibi. The man who had held me as I had wept. The man who had been my rock, my brother, my fellow survivor. He had been there. He had been with her. And he had lied. Every single day for a year. The country of my grief, which I had thought was a desolate but known territory, suddenly had a new, terrifying, and unknown continent. And I was completely, utterly, and devastatingly lost. The image in the mirror was a quiet digital scream. It was a single, irrefutable fact that detonated the entire, carefully constructed narrative of the past year of my life. Liam was there. The thought was a virus, a piece of malicious code that began to replicate and corrupt every file in the archive of my memory. Liam was there. The thought was a virus, a piece of malicious code that began to replicate and corrupt every file in the archive of my memory. Liam was there. He had been there. He had been with her. And he had lied. Every single day for a year. The country of my grief, which I had thought was a desolate but known territory, suddenly had a new, terrifying, and unknown continent. And I was completely, utterly, and devastatingly lost. The image in the mirror was a quiet digital scream. It was a single, irrefutable fact that detonated the entire, carefully constructed narrative of the past year of my life. Liam was there. The thought was a virus, a piece of malicious code that began to replicate and corrupt every file in the archive of my memory. Liam was there. The thought was a virus, a piece of malicious code that began to replicate and corrupt every file in the archive of my memory. Liam was there. The thought was a virus. My grief for Cora, which had been a pure, if agonizing emotion, was now contaminated. It was tangled with a new, ugly, and deeply unsettling variable, betrayal. My first desperate instinct was denial. It was a trick of the light. It was a ghost in the machine, a pareidolia effect created by the dust and the decay and my own grief-stricken mind. It was a face that looked like Liam, but it couldn't be him. He had an alibi. The wedding, the tuxedo, the text message. My mind clung to these facts, these load-bearing pillars of my reality. But the man in the reflection was not a ghost. I downloaded a dozen different photo-enhancing software programs. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of obsessive forensic focus. I was no longer a grieving husband preserving his wife's legacy. I was a cold case detective reopening an investigation that had been closed for a year. I clarified the image. I adjusted the contrast. I ran it through facial recognition algorithms that I downloaded from a series of increasingly shady corners of the internet. And with every new process, the face in the mirror became clearer, sharper, and more undeniably his. The mole just above his right eyebrow, the small white scar on his chin from a childhood bicycle accident. It was him. The alibi, the rock-solid, perfect alibi, was a lie. This realization was a new kind of grief. I was not just mourning the death of my wife. I was now mourning the death of my best friend, the death of our friendship, the death of the one single person I had trusted to help me navigate the terrible, lonely country of my loss. He had not been my fellow survivor. He had been a tourist, a man with a guilty secret, performing the role of the grieving friend. I needed more than just a face and a reflection. That was a ghost. It was my word against his, and my word was the word of a man who had been half mad with grief for a year. I needed a timeline. I needed a blueprint. I had to deconstruct the last year of my life and find the other lies, the other cracks in the facade that I had been too blind to see. My investigation began with the wedding, the perfect alibi. I started with the text message he had sent me that morning, the picture of him in the tuxedo. I examined the metadata of the image file, the small, hidden string of data that is embedded in every digital photograph. The timestamp was correct. The location data, however, was not. The GPS coordinates in the metadata did not place him at the wedding venue in the other state. They placed him at a gas station just 20 miles outside of our own town. He had not sent me that picture from the wedding. He had sent it from a location just a short drive from the hospital he had been with my wife at. The tuxedo was a costume. The wedding was a stage set. And his entire performance of that day had been a lie. I felt a cold, creeping sensation in my gut. This was not a simple, impulsive act. This was premeditated. This was a conspiracy. My mind, now a cold, analytical engine, began to work backwards. I started going through my own archives, my own digital life, cross-referencing my memories with his stories. The business trip to Chicago he had taken in the spring. I did a search of Cora's credit card statements, which I still had access to. And there it was, a charge from a small boutique hotel in Chicago, for 2 people, on the exact same dates as his trip. The solo hiking trip she had taken to the mountains in the summer. I went back through my own phone records. I saw a call I had made to Liam that weekend, just to check in. I had asked him where he was, and he had said he was at home, just watching the game. But the cell tower that had pinged his phone was not in our city. It was in a small town at the base of the very same mountains where she had been hiking. The evidence was everywhere. It had always been there. A trail of digital breadcrumbs, a constellation of small, seemingly insignificant lies that, when connected, formed a clear and devastating picture. They had been having an affair. A long-term, carefully coordinated, and deeply deceptive affair. Our urbex trips, my weekends away at photography conferences, his business trips, they had used the very architecture of our lives, of our friendship, as the scaffolding for their own secret world. The grief I felt was a complex, multi-layered thing now. There was the grief for Cora's death. There was the grief for the death of our marriage, a marriage that had apparently been a lie for years. And now, there was the grief for the death of my friendship with Liam, a friendship that had been the one steady, unwavering thing in my life. I was completely, utterly, and profoundly alone. I had to confront him. But how? To simply show him the photograph would be to invite more lies, more denials. He was a master of the plausible story. He would have an explanation, a trick of the light, a coincidence. I needed more. I needed something he couldn't deny. I needed to break his real alibi, the wedding. I had to talk to his sister. Her name was Maya. She was a sweet, kind woman whom I had always liked. Calling her felt like a betrayal of its own kind. like dragging an innocent bystander into the wreckage. But I had to know. I called her. I invented a pretext, a clumsy story about finding an old gift from the wedding that had never been sent. I asked her about the day, and as she spoke, her voice full of the happy, nostalgic memories of her wedding day, I listened not to her words, but to the small, almost imperceptible hesitations in her voice. She was not a good liar. Liam was amazing that day, she said, her voice a little too bright. He gave the most beautiful speech. A little shorter than we had practiced, but it was perfect. Shorter than they had practiced. Why? He had to leave a little early, she continued, her voice quickening, as if she were trying to rush past this part of the story. He got a call, an emergency at his office, something about a big project. He was so upset he had to miss the dancing. An emergency at his office, on a Saturday. It was a weak, flimsy lie, a patch on a story that was threatening to come apart at the seams. I knew Liam's boss. I knew there had been no emergency. She was covering for him. She had been covering for him for a year. She was part of the conspiracy. The rot was deeper than I had ever imagined. The final piece of the puzzle came from a place I didn't expect. It came from Cora herself. As part of my digital seance, I had been trying to recover deleted files from her laptop's hard drive. It was a long, tedious process, like trying to reassemble a shredded document. Most of what I found was corrupted, unusable. But then I found it. A single, small audio file, a voice memo she had recorded on her phone and had then transferred to her computer. A file she had clearly tried to delete. It was dated the morning of the accident. It was a message. Not to me. Not to Liam.
It was a message to her therapist, a woman whose name I did not recognize. Her voice on the recording was a strange mixture of anxiety and a kind of giddy, terrified excitement. "I'm going to tell him," she was saying. "I have to. I'm going to tell Jasper everything about me and Liam, about the fact that I'm leaving him. Liam is meeting me there at Mercy. He's leaving the wedding now. He says it's too dramatic, that we should just leave. But I have to do it face to face. I owe him that. I owe him the truth. I just hope he can forgive me." The audio file ended. The silence in my studio was absolute. The final, terrible, and most heartbreaking piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She had been going to tell me. The exploration of the hospital had not been a cover for a tryst. It had been the chosen venue for the end of our marriage. And the accident, the freak, random, and tragic accident, had happened before she could. She had died with the truth on her lips, a confession she had never been able to make. And Liam, he had not just lied about being there. He had lied about why he was there. He had been there to support her, to be her getaway driver, to be her future. And when the ceiling had collapsed, when she had been taken from him, he had made a choice. He had run. He had fled the scene, leaving her body in the rubble, and he had driven, at speed, back to his sister's wedding, arriving just in time to give his short speech and solidify his perfect, unshakable alibi. He had not just lied to me, he had abandoned her. He had chosen his own self-preservation over her memory, over her truth. The man who had been pretending to be my brother in grief had, in fact, been the ultimate coward. A man who had fled the scene of his own life, leaving me to mourn a woman who was not who I thought she was, and a friendship that had been a lie from the very beginning. The grief I felt now was a pure, cold, and clarifying thing. I was not just a victim of a betrayal. I was the sole living witness to a story that no one else knew. And I had a decision to make. What do you do with a truth that is more painful than any lie? What do you do with a ghost that is more real than any living person? I did not know. I only knew that the quiet, respectful mourning was over. The investigation had just begun. The knowledge I now possessed was a toxic asset. It was a truth so heavy, so radioactive, that it contaminated every memory I had of the two people I had loved most in the world. My grief, which had been a clean, if painful wound, was now infected.
The image of Cora, my beautiful, tragic, martyred wife, had been replaced by a more complex, more flawed, and deeply human woman. A woman who was on the verge of leaving me. A woman who was in love with my best friend. And the image of Liam, my rock, my brother, my fellow mourner, had been replaced by a coward, a liar, a man who had abandoned the woman he supposedly loved at the moment of her death to protect his own skin. I was living in a house of ghosts, but they were not the gentle, sorrowful ghosts I had imagined. They were ugly, complicated, and demanding ghosts, and they were all whispering a single, relentless question in my ear. What do you do now? For weeks, I did nothing. I was paralyzed by the sheer gravitational weight of the truth. I would sit in her studio, the audio file of her final confession playing on a loop in my headphones, her voice a ghostly echo in the room she had left behind. I was a man trapped between two competing narratives, the beautiful, sanitized lie that the world believed, and the ugly, messy truth that only I knew. To reveal the truth would be to unleash a hurricane. It would mean confronting Liam, an act that would be a form of emotional violence I was not sure I was capable of. It would mean telling our friends, our families, that the perfect, tragic story they had all invested in was a fraud. It would mean desecrating the memory of Cora, transforming her from a tragic victim into a flawed, adulterous woman. It would be an act of profound and perhaps unforgivable cruelty. To keep the truth a secret, however, was its own form of torture. It would mean continuing to live the lie. It would mean continuing to sit across from Liam at our weekly dinners, listening to his hollow words of comfort, knowing that he was a co-conspirator in the lie that was my life. It would mean protecting the man who had betrayed me, who had abandoned her. It would be a betrayal of my own truth, and in a strange, twisted way, a betrayal of hers. She had wanted to tell me the truth. She had died on her way to do it. Was it not my duty, as the last person who had truly known her, to see that final act through? My days became a quiet, obsessive investigation into the nature of my own feelings. I was a man triaging his own soul. What was more important, the sanctity of a dead woman's memory, or the truth of a living man's life? The comfort of a shared beautiful lie, or the lonely, brutal honesty of a private truth? The path forward, when it finally revealed itself to me, came not from a place of anger or a desire for revenge, but from my own native language, the language of the image. I was a photographer. I did not deal in words, but in light, in shadow, in composition. My truth and my reckoning would not be a shouted accusation. It would be a single, perfectly composed, and utterly devastating picture. My plan began to form. It was a quiet, methodical, and deeply personal project. I would create an exhibition, a photography exhibition, in her memory. I would call it Echoes. It would be a tribute to her work, to her eye, to the beauty she had found in the forgotten corners of the world. It would be held at a small, independent gallery in the city, and Liam, as her greatest champion and my closest friend, would be the guest of honor. I proposed the idea to him one evening over our usual somber dinner. His reaction was exactly as I had predicted. He was deeply, profoundly moved. "Jasper, that's the most beautiful idea I've ever heard," he said, his eyes welling up with what I knew, with a sickening certainty, were crocodile tears. "It's the perfect tribute. She would have loved it. Of course, I'll help. Anything you need." He became my enthusiastic partner in the project. He helped me select the photographs. He helped me write the captions. He helped me design the layout of the gallery space. We worked together for months, two men building a beautiful, elaborate monument to a woman we had both, in our own ways, loved and betrayed. And all the while, I was working on the final, secret piece of the exhibition, the centerpiece, the one photograph that would not be in the catalog, the one that would only be unveiled on the opening night. I took the image from the hospital, the one with the reflection, and I worked on it with the obsessive focus of a medieval monk illuminating a sacred manuscript.
I did not alter it. I did not manipulate it. I simply clarified it. I used every tool at my disposal to make the reflection in the mirror as sharp, as clear, and as undeniable as possible. I was not creating a lie. I was simply bringing the truth into focus. I had the final image printed on a massive gallery-sized canvas. It was a beautiful, haunting photograph on its own, a masterpiece of her unique, melancholic vision. But hidden within it, in a small, almost insignificant corner, was the ghost. The ghost of Liam, his face a perfect, clear, and damning indictment. I built a special frame for it, a frame with a built-in museum-quality spotlight that was aimed with a laser-like precision directly at the reflection in the mirror. The opening night of the exhibition was a huge success. The gallery was packed. Our friends, her family, the local arts community, they were all there. The mood was somber, respectful, and deeply appreciative of her talent. Liam was the perfect host, moving through the crowd, telling stories about Cora, his voice full of a practiced, heartfelt grief. He was the keeper of her flame, the guardian of her memory. I watched him, and I felt nothing but a cold, quiet, and profound sense of pity. He was a man who had built his life on a lie, and he had no idea that the foundation was about to be ceremoniously and very publicly removed. At the end of the evening, after the speeches and the toasts, I took the microphone for the final word. I thanked everyone for coming. I spoke of Cora's passion, of her unique vision. And then I directed their attention to the large, veiled canvas at the end of the gallery. "There is one last piece I would like to share with you," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. "It is the last photograph Cora ever took, a self-portrait, a final look at the world through her own beautiful eyes." I walked over to the canvas. Liam was standing beside me, his face glowing with a proprietary pride.
The photograph was revealed, and at the same moment, the hidden spotlight in the frame clicked on, illuminating the small, cracked mirror in the corner of the image, and the face that was reflected within it with a brilliant, undeniable, and utterly devastating clarity. The silence in the gallery was not a respectful hush, it was a vacuum. It was the absolute, profound absence of sound that follows a sudden, violent, and unexpected decompression. The 100 or so people in the room were frozen, their eyes fixed on the massive, illuminated photograph. At first, there was just confusion. They saw the main image, the beautiful, haunting portrait of Cora, a tragic artist in her final moments. They saw the art. They saw the story they had all come to believe. But then their eyes were drawn, as I had designed them to be, to the small, unnaturally bright spot of light in the corner, to the mirror, to the face within it. A low, collective murmur began to ripple through the crowd. It was a sound of dawning, horrified understanding. People began to turn their heads, their gazes shifting from the photograph to the man who was standing right next to it, to Liam. He was staring at the image, his face as pale and as frozen as a death mask. The color had drained from his skin, leaving a waxy, translucent sheen. He was not looking at the art. He was looking at a ghost, his own. He was looking at the irrefutable, public, and brilliantly lit proof of his lie. The narrative he had so carefully constructed for a year, the role of the grieving, supportive friend, had been utterly and silently demolished by a single, perfectly placed beam of light. He looked at me, and his eyes were wide with a kind of pleading, terrified disbelief. He had walked into a tribute and had found himself in a trap. A quiet, elegant, and inescapable trap. I did not say a word. I did not need to. The photograph spoke for me. It spoke the truth that I had carried, alone, for a year. It asked the question that was now hanging, thick and heavy in the air of that silent room. What were you doing there, Liam? I did not give him a chance to answer, to lie, to construct a new, more elaborate fiction. I simply turned and I walked away from the photograph, away from him, and I moved through the silent, parting crowd. I walked out of the gallery, out into the cool night air. I did not look back. My work was done. My exhibition was complete. I had not presented an accusation. I had presented a piece of art. And like all great art, it revealed a truth, and it left the viewer to grapple with the consequences. The aftermath, I learned later, was a quiet, social implosion. Liam had simply and silently collapsed. Not a physical collapse, but a social one. He had tried, in the days that followed, to offer an explanation. A story about a secret final meeting to end their affair. A story that was a desperate partial truth, but that no one now was willing to believe. The lie he had told about the wedding, the perfect, unshakable alibi, had become the anchor that now dragged him under. If he had lied about that, what else was he lying about? The questions, the suspicions, the whispers, they did the work for me. I did not have to be the accuser. The community, our community of friends, became the jury. And their verdict was a quiet, social shunning. He was not charged with a crime. He was simply erased. He sold his house a few months later. He moved to a different city. He disappeared. He became a ghost of his own making. As for me, my life began to slowly find a new kind of focus. The exhibition had been a catharsis. It had been an act of truth-telling that had lanced the infected wound of my grief. I was no longer a man haunted by a secret. I was a man who was now free to truly and honestly mourn. I mourned the woman I had loved, the vibrant, flawed, and deeply human woman who had been on her way to tell me the truth, and who had been robbed of that final, honest act. And I mourned the man who had been my best friend, the man I had known and loved for 20 years, the man who had been lost, not in the collapse of a building, but in the collapse of his own courage. My photography changed. I stopped exploring the dead, empty spaces. My lens turned instead towards the living. I began to find a new kind of beauty, not in the grand, haunting decay of the past, but in the small, quiet, and resilient moments of the present. A child's laugh, an old couple holding hands, the way the light would fall on a city street after a rainstorm. I did not forget Cora. I did not erase her. She lived on, in the beautiful, haunting photographs that now hung on the walls of my own quiet home. But she was no longer a ghost that haunted me. She was a memory, a complex, painful, and ultimately cherished part of the story of the man I had become. The country of my grief was still a place I visited, but it was no longer my home. I had, at long last, found my way back across the border, back into the messy, complicated, and beautiful world of the living. And I knew, as I looked through my viewfinder at the world, that my own final self-portrait was still a long, long way from being taken. Thanks for being here on Reddit Whispers. I've shared my story, but now I want to hear yours. What's the most surprising decision that turned everything around for you? Your comment could be the lifeline someone else is looking for today.